All right, let's make a start. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Australian Dementia Network Early to Mid-Career Research Accelerator Working Group webinar focused on involving people with dementia, care partners, and families in dementia research webinar today. My name is Nadika Dissanayake. I'm the co-chair of the ADNeT Early to Mid-Career Research Accelerator Group. And my other co-chair is Professor Lee Fei Lo, who is also present in the panel today. And I also want to acknowledge the webinar organizers, Dr. Claire Burley and Dr. Julian Winslow. First of all, to begin our webinar, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land in which this webinar is conducted today and pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. So I'm just going to share my screen here to walk you through the program for today. So a little bit of housekeeping to begin with. I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but there is a Q&A function at the bottom. So feel free to pass your questions in the Q&A function as we speak. In today's webinar, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers, including two dementia advocates, where we will start our discussion with. And we have two presentations from our researchers from various backgrounds. So let's begin our webinar today. To start with, I'd like to first ask the audience, and feel free to pass your answers in the chat function here, which I will monitor. What does it mean to you when we talk about involving people with living experiences with dementia, care partners, and families in dementia research? So let's just think about it for a minute. And if I can get you to use the chat function here and place your thoughts here, please. Let's start thinking about it. Peter Worthy is saying, I'm involved in developing technology in order to make sure that is delivered real value. I need to involve people with actual living experience. Great answer. What do others think? Usability is not enough. That's correct. Anyone else want to choose the chat? And yes, great. Gabriella saying it means gaining insight into the experiences and needs of people living with dementia and creating an opportunity to address these identified needs through research that is ultimately more likely to be implemented in practice that is used by those with lived experiences. Great, thank you. Chris is saying ensuring research is designed with their reported needs rather than perceived needs from our perspectives. Excellent, thank you. And Asia is saying ensuring that the research that we are conducting, research that people living with dementia will truly benefit from. Excellent, thank you. Any other thoughts from the audience? Thanks, Claire. Asking them how they feel about the project, the aims, design, and documentation. Great, thank you very much. Feel free to keep jotting down your thoughts on it. What about fundamental research? We will address that. Thank you. All right, let's share my slides again. And thanks for sharing your thoughts. So I'll go through some of the key definitions of what do we mean by involving people with living experiences of dementia, care partners, and families in dementia research. Let's think about the definitions. There's three definitions I'd like for you to understand, because some of these words are used interchangeably in many occasions, and people can get a bit confused of what is involvement, what is engagement, and what is actually research participation. So involvement, these definitions are taken from some of these resources, in particular from the Clinical Trials Toolkit. What do we mean by involvement? Involvement means actively work with researchers and research organizations to help shape decisions about health research priorities, policy, and practice. For example, defining research questions and identifying outcomes of interest and helping to design some of the research projects and improving the content and readability of participant information and assisting with interpreting results as well. And what do we mean by engagement? Engagement is about information and knowledge about research is shared to better inform on why, how, where, and by whom research is conducted. So it's, for example, sharing research findings, sharing information through public talks and social media, and even research open days. So I think a lot of people know and can relate to research participation. Research participation is taking part in research. So to take part in research, being recruited to take part in a research study, for example, and a lot of the times you get to complete questionnaires, research interviews, or participate in focus groups. And you can also provide data or tissue that is analyzed as part of a research study. So these are the definitions. And if you do have any questions or queries, please feel free to type in your Q&A. So I am going to stop sharing now. And I'd like to introduce our next speakers in our discussion, who are two dementia advocates, Jane Thompson and Anne Fish. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And let's start with having a conversation about involving people with living experiences with dementia, care partners, and families. So to begin with, I'd like you to introduce yourself. Let's go to Jane. Would you like to tell us about yourself and how you got involved in dementia research? Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Debra, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you all today. So the only reason I'm here today is actually because my husband had Alzheimer's disease. He was diagnosed way back in 2004, and when he was 69, and he had a very rapidly progressing form of the disease, and he died in less than 4 years after he was diagnosed. So I always say that I felt like I was catapulted into a foreign territory where I didn't know the language and I didn't have a roadmap. And so, it was a very harrowing experience for me. It was a very harrowing experience for him. And, I really struggled to know how I could best support him as he really struggled with the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So at the time, we were never approached to participate in research or to be involved in research in any way, although I think we would have welcomed that if that had come. So I think times have changed quite a bit now, so there are a lot more opportunities for people to both participate in and be involved in research. So essentially, I I'll go on to talk about how I actually became involved. And that was really, it wasn't until after he died, in fact, 3 years afterwards in 2010, I was approached by a friend of mine who, via Alzheimer's Australia, as it was known then, because Alzheimer's Australia, under the leadership of Glenn Rees, were establishing a network specifically for people with dementia and carers called the Consumer Dementia Research Network. And they wanted to set up this group who could work with researchers, in partnership with researchers, and set priorities for some, particularly for some knowledge translation projects. So that was a fantastic opportunity, which I don't think I would have, I don't think I would have known about opportunities or even looked for them unless I'd been given that opportunity to join this network. And it was, as I say, it was an initiative of Alzheimer's Australia, but also the Dementia Collaborative Research Centres, as they were then, who jointly saw the need to create opportunities for links between researchers and people with that lived experience. So look, that was important. It provided a pathway for me to get involved. It provided access for researchers to people who are interested in being involved in research. And it was a very well supported and mutually supportive network. So I think that sense of belonging to a group of people with a common purpose who were valued, respected and well supported was very, very important. And that opened up a whole lot of other avenues. Unfortunately, it was only supported until 2015. So while quite a number of us had actually started on this pathway towards involvement in research, that didn't continue on, and things have changed quite a bit since then. Unfortunately, I think we need to actually resurrect something like that, so there are both that pathway for people to get involved and the means whereby researchers can actually find appropriate people to be involved in their research.
Well, thank you very much. And I'll just get you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the opportunities you have received in terms of involving with dementia research. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nadika, and thank you again for allowing me to come and put my perspective about, as a person who's living with dementia, give my ideas about dementia research in terms of my involvement. I live in Adelaide. I have a nursing admin background and had an interest in gerontology. I've worked with the Health Commission of Victoria as a nursing advisor. And over in South Australia, when I got married, we moved here, and I was involved in coordinating services for people with cognitive impairment and dementia and younger onset dementia. So I was pretty versed in it when all of a sudden, you know, I think it was about 2012, and I was 59 and I was diagnosed with dementia. And it was thought to be probably Alzheimer's, which has now morphed into Lewy body dementia or Lewy body disease. I think I'm really lucky because it didn't have the stigma attached to it that it, for me, that it has for a lot of people, because I knew a lot about dementia. I'd worked with Dementia Australia, or Alzheimer's Australia as it was then. They were just down the road. And I now live at home. I've got my husband's my carer, and we live a very fulfilled life and very positive life. And I think I'm lucky because I do have insight into my diagnosis, and I notice the changes and things. I've been actively involved in advocacy work with Dementia Australia almost since the diagnosis, basically. I'm now a member of the Dementia Australia Advisory Committee and on the DARF scientific panel, and I'm involved in lots of advocacy research projects along with Jane and advocacy roles, and I've spoken at conferences and meetings in South Australia and nationally. I think I first became involved in dementia research when I applied to be involved with DARF about, probably 3+ years ago. And although I'd been involved in other projects representing people living with dementia. And since then, I've been involved with various universities and individuals in advising on the actual research and in co-design projects. Anything from whether I thought the research would be of benefit to people living with dementia and carers and families, to plain English understanding of the information. And I guess, you know, you could say, well, why are you doing it? And I do it because it's just so exciting. I guess it's mutually beneficial to me and to researchers, but I get to meet the most amazing researchers, and I'm absolutely blown away with the ideas and the research proposals and things. And it's empowering. And I'm sure in lots of ways it's sort of helped maintain or regain a lot of my mental capacity and my cognitive ability. And it also means that researchers have real life knowledge of being actually engaged with somebody living with dementia. I suppose it almost adds validity to research, or at least credibility, and it helps ensure that the research undertaken is identified as Dementia Australia priority areas as well. But I just find it very exciting, and it's just wonderful to be involved with people like yourself and Jane particularly, who's sort of like a vague mentor, I would say, to me. Not so vague, but you know. And I just really enjoy it, and I hope that I can represent people living with dementia and their carers and families to the best of, you know, my ability anyway, my knowledge of people with dementia.
Well, thank you so much, Anne and Jane. It's wonderful to hear these accounts, and I'm just so glad that you are enjoying being part of research, being involved in research. And Anne has, I must say, Anne has been really instrumental taking part in our own research unit advocacy board as well. So, and Jan has also had some involvement at past with the NNIDR Dementia Research Involvement Group as well. Yeah. I think a lot of the times, and also coming from our Q&A, that people ask, do consumers meaning people with lived experiences, their care partners and families, do they actually have expertise to really be involved in research design and interpretation of research? And how do they get training to do this? So I think to begin with, I'll ask Jane first. Have you actually had any formal training on involving in research?
Yes, so look, I mean, that was one of the things that joining the research network that I mentioned, the Alzheimer's Australia one, that was part of their program, was to actually offer training in what I would call public involvement in research. So we all attended the training program, which is still available now. Anne Mackenzie in Western Australia runs programs not for dementia research specifically, but for research in general. So we all took part in that training. But I think there's a bit of a myth, and even I have a background in research myself, so it was in women's health research, but a completely different field. But I was a little bit wary about getting involved in dementia research, because I thought, well, you know, I really wasn't quite sure how I could contribute to it. But I think you don't have to be an expert in research and research methods. That's not what we're there for. What we bring is the experiential knowledge that we have because of the fact that either we've been carers of someone with dementia, or we're currently carers, or we actually have a diagnosis of dementia. And that is something which not all researchers will have. So we bring a different perspective. For clinical type research, I mean, just to make sure that the way in which, you know, researchers are going to go about recruiting participants, what sort of patient information materials are you going to give to them, how good are the questionnaires that you've developed? How easy are they going to be completed? So we can have input into all those sorts of things, but we don't need to be experts in research methods. And of course, you know, we understand it takes years to be trained as a researcher. So that's not our role. Our role is there to bring our perspective, to add value to the research by ensuring that it's relevant and that it's practical and it's likely to lead to outcomes that will improve the lives of people with dementia and carers.
Yeah, I agree totally with what Jane said. I haven't had any formal training as such, although, you know, Dementia Australia is very keen on, at the moment, in developing some sort of link between research and people living with dementia too, and that's at their sort of forefront too. But I guess you learn, I mean, I know what I've got to offer in relation to my experiences and experiences of other people living with dementia because of my involvement with other people who are also living with dementia or carers of, and families. And I guess what we bring is exactly what Jane said, but I think there's a little bit of mentoring going on in there too, Jane, isn't there? The more you're involved with research, the more, and you're sitting there with other advocates or other consumers, you're picking up on ways in which they view things or see things or how they can implement things. Also, I think with DARF, when you look at the applicant's book, information book, there's areas in there that help define what we're looking for as a somebody who's reviewing the applications, and it sets out the areas that are going to be important for that person to display to make it something that I can understand and you know, well, you know, not judge, but, you know, review properly. But it's a bit like osmosis at the moment, I think.
Yeah. So just to clarify, I think, does everybody know what Anne is talking about when you talk about DARF? So that's the Dementia Australia Research Foundation Scientific Panel. And that's actually one of the areas where I first got involved. And that was through the Alzheimer's Australian Network. I mean, that opened up lots of avenues for all of us. And one of the big one was actually getting our members integrated into the NHMRC Cognitive Decline Partnership Centre, which now no longer exists, but we were fully integrated into that centre because of the commitment of the leadership of that centre. There was a paid person who coordinated the involvement of people with dementia and carers in research. We were involved in every research project which went through that centre. But another avenue which opened up also was for two of us were appointed to what was then the Alzheimer's Australia Research Foundation Scientific Panel, and that was the first time that they had people with lived experience on that panel. Up to that time, all of the grant applications which went to the scientific panel just had scientific reviewers. And that was a very interesting experience because when I first joined, there was always a great sense of, oh, this is really, really interesting and fascinating. And I was terribly grateful to be there. But every year or for a couple of years, I'd read over 100 grant applications and I'd make my little comments, mostly just reading the sections that were relevant to us. And then I kept thinking, okay, I'm doing all this, but is it really making any difference? What's the point? And also the question that they had in that early round, back then, it was about 2016, there was a question which researchers had to answer, and it said, and they used the term consumer then, which now is going out of fashion, but it was something like, will you involve consumers in your research? And so, of course, most people just said no, and that was the end of it. So then I said, hang on, we need to change this question. And people also got confused about who was the consumer. So is the consumer the person with dementia? Is it the person with dementia and the carer, or is it both, or yeah, either one or the other or whatever? And then they would answer it in a very confused way. So I said, okay, let's change the question. Let's make it How will you involve people with dementia and carers in your research? So, and then eventually it got to the point where our assessments actually contributed to the final scoring of the grant application. And so that means there was actually some point in being there. There was some point in giving your input. And I introduced that actually based on what is done in cancer research, where they have a much more rigorous process of involvement of people with lived experience in their grant application and funding processes. So I think it's moved on a long way, and
it's still very important that, you know, the consumer involvement it's really quite interesting that even though it's still there and it's weighted and the weighting is added into the final scoring and things, it's still missed out sometimes. And you have the most wonderful, you know, application and think, my gosh, this is just fabulous research. But they don't know what anybody living with dementia it looks like, or how they're going to be involved, or really anything personal about it. And it just lets it down from our point of view. Whereas you'd love to say, in other ways, it's met the needs of being really interesting, and positive outcomes, and a really great area of research. But they just haven't taken the time to actually look at anybody with dementia, let alone, you know, involve them. And it's really changing now.
I hear you. I think a lot of the times researchers with basic and fundamental research, they seem to struggle. How can they sort of write a grant application, or in fact have people living with dementia, or support persons or family members? How can they actually involve in research? So when I talk about basic sort of fundamental research, meaning laboratory-based research, researchers who work in data mining, epidemiological sort of based research, they don't really include people as participants, and they probably have very less involvement with dementia advocates or their supporters, families. So I'd like to sort of hear more about your thoughts. Who would like to? Jen, do you want to?
Yes. So, look, I think there are a few sort of misconceptions about how the extent to which people are keen to be involved in basic research. I would love to be involved in basic research. I love hearing about all the fundamental research that's going on in dementia, and that all, I mean, it's amazing. And that's, as Anne said earlier, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm highly motivated to do this, because there's so much interesting stuff going on. So they are keen to know what's going on at the laboratory bench. But there's also the reports which you can read about, which say, you know, people who are basic scientists who have involved people in their research. I think it brings a greater focus to their research, a context to the research that they're doing, but it also helps them with their lay communication skills. It opens up public engagement channels, and it also sort of emphasizes to them the reasons why they're doing the research in the first place. So it's a great motivator, I think, to know that, you know, these are the real people who are going to be impacted by the research that I'm doing on this rat or whatever. And I think it also has the potential to attract public and private funding. But I can give you a good example of a program which I'm involved in, is the Walter Eliza Hall Institute Buddy program. So, and this, most of the focus of research at the Institute was cancer research. And I think cancer is way, way further ahead of dementia in terms of involving people with lived experience in their research programs. And I've only been involved with this particular one for a couple of years, but it's been going for a number of years now. They've got over 100 what they call buddies, research buddies, and each of the researchers at the Walter Eliza Hall Institute has a buddy or two buddies, and they regularly meet with them, they talk with them, it's a two-way sort of communication. And so and then the buddies will end up actually being involved in grant applications with them, because they actually have to do this to get, for a lot of the cancer research funding, you have to have public involvement. You have, and it's about 50% of the scoring of their grant applications through some of the state cancer councils comes from the people with lived experience. So I think, that's an example of an organisation who had this commitment that they thought it was really important to bring people with lived experience to work alongside in partnership with the people who are doing the basic fundamental research. And it works, it's a mutual benefit both ways. So it can be done.
Yeah, I agree. And, sorry, I was just going to say, it's not hard to, just talk to somebody with dementia and, share your project and at least show some interest in the actual people who are going to benefit along the way, even if it's not directly out of your direct research, but it will lead to other things. And it just shows a commitment to the fact that you really are doing the research for the right reasons and not just your own, I think.
Absolutely. I really like the buddy idea.
Yeah,
that's such a great idea. So I've got lots of comments coming on chat as well, and really thanking both of you for your involvement from our audience. So that's really great to hear. There's one question coming from Lisa here. Lisa says, I do lots of qualitative research, but I struggle to get a focus group of people living with dementia or carers. Is it because it's a focus group and there are inherent barriers to focus group designs? They're just interested to sort of know, would people prefer, interview sort of based, or are there any sort of barriers in terms of participating in focus group type study design? Any thoughts on that? Or
I would think that there'd be no barriers, focus groups or interviews or surveys, questionnaires, they're all part and parcel of things that, it's fairly easy to carry out, I would have thought. And focus groups are great because that's where you really get a whole lot of different ideas. And you meet some really interesting people that you can perhaps connect with later on in your research if you want too.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how the researcher is actually, what channels are they going through to try and find people? Because that is a big issue, and you hear it quite a lot from researchers. Oh, it's just really too hard to find people. And that's why I think having sort of an identified network, which like the one we used to have, which needs to grow and get bigger, is important. I mean, we've got some groups which are starting to set up their own groups, like Lee Fay Lowe started the group with the Sydney Dementia Network, the Lived Experience Expert Advisory Panel, which I'm on that. And I think we need to grow that a little bit, but that's somewhere where researchers who are part of the Sydney Dementia Network can come to the panel and put their proposals to them to be discussed. And, I would imagine that then some of those members of the panel could become involved in their projects more deeply, and that's happened, or they'll have connections which will enable researchers to, find the people that they want to be involved or to be participants. So I think things are changing. There's lots of positive trends, like, the Lee Fay Lowe's group. There's another group Melinda Martin Khan has set up at the University of Queensland, a patient care advisory board, which has a similar sort of role. So organisations are starting to build their own networks. I think we need to connect all these networks together in sort of some central organisation.
I agree.
So there's a conduit both for the researchers to find the people and for the people to find ways to become involved in research.
Dementia Australia sends out to its advocates now lists of research that has come their way that they're asking for people to be involved with, and that's been happening just the last year really, but that's obviously going to grow. And
Yeah.
so if you're interested in taking up, you just apply there, and then to the, you know, we might get 4 or 5 research proposals that come our way for all the advocates, not just for the ones who are on the Dementia Australia Advocacy Committee.
Yeah.
And, you know, you can reply to that. So it's just starting, Jane, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
But it's a bit ad hoc. I agree.
Yeah, it is. It needs to be formalised more, I think. But and also you have to remember people are busy. So sometimes, you know, time commitments are an issue. I mean, COVID's probably made things, well, it's made things better in some ways, and at least, you know, opportunities for lots of webinars and things like that, and online conferences and things. But on the other hand, you know, it's limited some of the activities which you might otherwise been able to do. I mean, if you're looking for participants, there's also Step Up for Dementia Research.
Yes.
So I'm on the public involvement panel for that program, and we're looking and hoping that perhaps if it gets funded or continues to get some funding, that might be also an avenue for people to register their interest in being involved in research in other ways, not just as a participant. So
yeah, absolutely. And I also, you know, agree with you. Having a reference group is invaluable. It's so valuable for us, and we've established that within our research, Faculty of Medicine at the University of Queensland as well, and it's part of it, and that's a great sort of network. And they don't have to meet in person; we meet online. Advocates are from throughout Australia, so and that's how we get. Research participation is by word of mouth as well, on top of, you know, reaching out to different channels like Step Up for Dementia, etc. So yeah, it's so valuable to have that that reference group involving people with dementia and their supporters, support people and families. So all right. I think just maybe a final sort of a quick question. We talked a lot about the good things that happened to you and how great it is. I'm actually wondering whether you ever encountered any bad experiences by involving in dementia research. Is there anything you can think about? Any sort of barriers you come across?
Generally, everybody who actually has all the projects and things have been really respectful, and there aren't too many bad experiences, you know, truly, because if they've taken the time to involve us, and they involve people like myself, then they realise the value of it, and so they're committed. But there's been the odd occasion, and it's only one, and I'm not going to be specific, but where I felt very, it was my diagnosis and my ability to be of use to the project was sort of being questioned by a very senior person. And I thought, this is just ridiculous. You know, that is so wrong. There are plenty of people with a lived experience of dementia who are really capable of being involved and offering, you know, really decent ideas and suggestions and research things. So in the end, instead of feeling affronted, I thought, well, that's your problem. It's not my problem, you know. So I didn't bother anymore. But you know, those things are few and far between. Generally, my experience has been very, very good, and felt very respected and very valued, as you know, I do with you in the DECA and with you, Jane.
Yeah. I think the only I wouldn't say I've had any really bad experience. I've had less than optimal experiences where, you know, I'll give the researchers full marks for effort, but they left, you know, if they've left things way too late, suddenly they're putting in a grant application, they realise that they've actually got to address some questions around involving people impacted by the disease. And so, oh gosh, who can we get? And obviously they've got my name from somewhere and said, oh, you know, could you be involved in this grant application, say, oh yes, that's fine, and if you're going to involve me, then this is how I would address the questions around that you're going to have to answer in your grant application. And then you'd hear nothing else, and I thought, well, that was, did they use it? Did the grant application ever get submitted? I never saw it. So just that's a sort of tokenistic way of involving people, I think, just because they had to tick a box. So I have had, there's been a bit of experience. I've had a couple of experiences like that, and also situations where it would have been nice to have a bit more feedback about the input that I had given. Did it actually make any difference? Where did it go? Did it change anything? So, but I think things are getting a lot better, and researchers are learning too. This is a new way of doing research. I think it's and it's a new role for a lot of us too. So I think we're kind of learning as we go. But there are lots of good examples that we can learn from. And particularly, in the UK, for example, where this is much more strongly embedded in their research culture and practice, we can learn a lot. And Anne and I are both involved in an international study, which is and I'm learning a lot from that one. So this is the Cobalt study, which is looking at the addition of memantine to the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors for people with Lewy body dementias. And I mean, they have a very formal structure for that, what they call patient and public involvement engagement. Someone is paid member of the research team, does all of the coordination of that side of the research project. There is a advisory group in the UK, and I'm leading an advisory group here in Australia. And, we're being sent documents to look at quite regularly. But we feel, I think, we're part of the research team, and we're respected and our input's valued. So there were lots of good examples of how to do it well.
And you can smell it, a tokenistic approach a mile off. I mean, I don't get involved in things that I don't think are going to be genuinely irrespectful, rather than just wanting the name to say that you're involved in the research. They're really different. I mean, I've never known anything about the James Lind Alliance.
Oh yeah.
And I've been involved with Emily Reed with drugs and pharmaceuticals, and it's taken 2 years to get to the stage that it's at now, and it's just an amazing process for research and things. And there's so many different ways, and it's just eye-opening.
Well, thank you so much. It's so amazing to see the involvement that both you, so Jane and Anne, have made with research. So I think on behalf of all researchers, I would really like to thank both of you for your absolutely amazing and informative talk, as well as the involvement that you have had. So we keep posting your questions in the Q&A. I'm quite mindful of time, so we will move on to our next speaker, but we do have time left, hopefully towards the end, to bring up some of the questions that are posted in Q&A. I'm sorry I couldn't take it at this point, but we'll bring it up. So to introduce our next speaker, I'd like to hand over to my co-chair, Dr. Claire Bailey. Thank you, Claire, and I really thank both Anne and Jen again for their discussion and sharing their experiences. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Over to you, Claire. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadika, and thank you so much again, Anne and Jane, for sharing your expertise with us. That was really fantastic. So next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Debra Brooks, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Queensland in the Centre for Clinical Research, and she's also coordinator of the Lived Experience Group at the Dementia Centre for Research Collaboration. Debra has a background in psychology and health services and has worked on projects focused on improving the quality of life and care of people with dementia and their families within the community and residential aged care settings, both in Australia and the UK. And she has a strong commitment in involving people living with dementia, as well as their care partners and families, in all aspects of research and service development. So over to you, Debra.
Thank you, Claire. I'm just going to try and share my screen, so just bear with me for one moment. Okay, can everybody see that okay, Claire? Great, thank you. So thank you for asking me to speak today. I am talking as the project coordinator of the DCRC Lived Experience Group. But as Claire said, I'm also a postdoctoral researcher both at QUT and the University of Queensland. And my research is sort of psychosocial research. The DCRC Lived Experience Group, that comprises of people with lived experience of dementia, as well as some of the DCRC directors and some of the DCRC researchers. One of the aims of this group really was to try and help provide advice and support to researchers. So particularly those researchers who were looking at putting in DCRC grant applications, and also people who were awarded DCRC grants for their research projects. And also members of this group speak from their experience at various conferences and webinars and symposiums as well, and they talk to researchers, which is another way of connecting to people. And at the moment, we're developing a guide for researchers on involving people with lived experience of dementia in research. And that guide should be available early next year. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm going to go through some of the things in that guide. So what does meaningful involvement in research mean? Well, Nadika has already kind of talked about the differences in terms. So we've talked about involvement, participation, and engagement. So what we are talking about is research with and by people with lived experience of dementia, rather than research that is on or about or for them. So we're talking about active involvement. So people can actually have an involvement in your research that makes a difference to what you're doing. It makes an impact on your research. It changes how you think about things or how you do things. And as Jane has mentioned as well, we're not talking about just ticking a box here, talking to one or two people and then just saying, yes, I've done that. We're talking about really involving people. Why is it important? It's important for a number of reasons. It's really good to have different perspectives on your research. So these people are the experts on what it is like to live with dementia, to receive a diagnosis, current treatments, health and social care services. They are the experts on this. And they're bringing so many different perspectives to your research. So they may be coming from a perspective of a physical perspective, emotional or social perspective, a cultural perspective, geographic perspective, depending on where people live. Not everybody lives in the cities. And also economics as well. So coming from a whole range of different perspectives. And they ask questions that you may not have even thought about because they have all this wealth of experience and different perspectives. And importantly, they keep your research focused on the outcomes that are important to people impacted by dementia. And that is really, really key. There's also a moral and ethical imperative to involvement. So people have a right to be involved in research, and we as researchers have a moral duty to include people. And we should be working in partnership to shape the dementia research landscape. And people have a vested interest in designing the services and treatments that might affect them, or it might affect other people in the future. People also have a right to say how public funds are used and whether research offers value for money. There isn't a limited amount of money to pay for research projects, and we have to think carefully about which projects are funded and which projects are not funded. Some funders now have a requirement to involve people. So we have talked a little bit about this morning. The DARF, Dementia Australia Research Foundation, expect you to complete in your grant applications how you intend to involve people with lived experience and whether they've been involved in developing your proposal. And this is to try and make sure that the research reflects an identified need or an area of priority. And also many funders now involve people impacted by dementia in decision making about the funding of research. So it's important for all of those different reasons. Who benefits? Well, people impacted by dementia benefit, and we've just heard from Anne and Jane about how it has benefited them. Having a meaningful contribution to research, increasing opportunities to feel valued and to feel empowered, enabling people to use their skills and knowledge or to learn new skills and knowledge through research, and increasing their social networks and relationships. For researchers, it can help us understand the many different realities of living with dementia. It's the best way is to just talk to people living with dementia and their families and care partners about what it is like for them. It can help you to identify and prioritize research that really matters the most. And then it helps make your research more relevant and accessible to people. For your research as a whole, it can help improve your design and your methods. It can help ensure that your language that you use is easy to understand and is respectful. And it can help aid the interpretation of your research findings. And then there's a benefit to society as well. So in terms of raising awareness of and support for dementia research is really, really important. It can also help with the more effective translation of research. And we all know that getting research into practice is really, really difficult. So having people and society on board with your research can be really, really beneficial. And there's also public confidence. So increasing public confidence because research is more transparent. There are lots of different types of involvement and different intensities of involvement, and these are just a few of them. People can be consulted about your research, so you could have an advisory group or a steering group with people involved and providing input as part of that process. But people can also be involved in actually conducting the research. So that could be recruiting participants or collecting data or helping with the analysis of data. People can also be involved in co-producing your research. So they can help design and conduct research in partnership with you as a researcher or as a co-investigator on your grants. And also people can lead research, so they can design and conduct research as the lead investigator themselves. So when is it good to involve people? Well, this is a really nice diagram that shows the different roles in the research network that people can be involved in. So we're talking about setting the agenda and research priorities and deciding what research to fund in terms of reviewing grant applications or interviewing grant applicants. For researchers, I guess we're looking at the research cycle. So involving people right at the beginning when you're thinking about your research questions, and having those conversations about the lived experience and shaping your research questions, as well as formed by the gaps in the knowledge. And also in terms of developing your research proposals, that could be part of an advisory group or as a co-investigator. Ethics is really important as well. So people can help you think about the ethical issues and really make you think through what it's like to be a participant in research and thinking through some of those perhaps more tricky things. They can help advise on recruitment strategies and help you design recruitment strategies and your information sheets as well to make sure that they're easy to understand, that you're using the right language. Help with collecting, analysing and interpreting data and helping disseminate your research findings. So getting the research out there to the people who may benefit the most. It's a whole range of times when you can involve people, and people can be involved at any or all of these stages. This is a really good principles for meaning involvement that the NHS Health Research has put out. Not specific to dementia, but I think it's really good principles anyway. Involving the right people, so thinking about people who have the relevant experience of the area that you're researching, because these people are likely to have a good idea of what will be acceptable to potential participants. And also thinking about other experiences and skills that people will have that may be relevant and important for your research. Principle 2 is about involving enough people. So this really does depend on the scope of your study. So if you have a large, well-funded study, you may want to set up a reference or advisory group with 6 to 8 people. If you're doing a PhD study or a small pilot study, we've talked about research buddies. So 2 or 3 people can be involved, but it should always be more than one person. It's good to get different perspectives, and also it's good to have peer support for the people who are involved. Principle 3 is involving people enough. So really as early as possible, and think about when you will work together, how often you will work together. And it's really good to have a nominated contact person so you can keep communication lines open, and the same person can then converse with the people that you are involving in your research. And then principle 4 is describing how it helps. So how are people being involved? Think about what you're asking people to do. Is it meetings? Is it other activities? Think about how it will add value to your research. That's really important. And then also, how are you going to communicate the study and the findings? We've talked a little bit about this morning as well, but it's really important to think about how you can find people to involve. And there's lots of different ways you can do this. Dementia Australia has a consumer engagement coordinator for research called Kate Harding, and that's her contact email there. I've checked with her, she said it was fine for me to let you know. So you can contact Kate and tell her about what you're doing or what you're thinking about doing, and you know, she'll have a chat with you, and she will then put your research out there to some of the Dementia Australia advocates, and may be able to help connect you. But you can also do things like advertising. You know, you can set up a research web page asking for people to get in touch if they're interested in being involved. You can advertise on social media, you can talk to support groups, you can go to community events, talk about your research. This is the kind of engagement space, but also ask people, would you be interested in being involved? You can also try and contact your local hospitals or memory clinics or community and support groups or care facilities, depending on the focus of your research, and just say, look, I'm carrying out this research, I'd really like to connect with people. Is there a consumer engagement person that I can talk to? Is there somebody who can put out some information maybe and connect me with people? It's also really important to think about diversity. So thinking about the different perspectives that you want to involve in your research. People living in rural or remote areas will probably have very different experiences. The same for people with cultural and linguistic backgrounds, the LGBTIQ+ community, and also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the NHMRC does have specific guidelines if you are thinking about involving people from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, which would be useful to look at. These are some really good, I think, principles for involving people that have been developed by a group of people living with dementia in the UK. And they've been developed specifically for researchers who are involving people with dementia in their research. And I think they're really nice principles to think about. Firstly, working in partnership. So really respecting views and lived experience as knowledge in its own right, and helping people to develop the skills that they might need as co-researchers. Respect and acknowledgement. So thinking about non-judgmental practices, practical considerations, realistic expectations. So being really flexible in how you involve people, allowing people plenty of time, give them time to think and to communicate, maybe think about different ways of involvement that makes it easier for people. Acknowledging their contributions. So that's acknowledging their contributions in any research or outputs that you might produce, but also in terms of their time and any out-of-pocket expenses they might have. Safety and well-being is really important. So this is protecting people from physical or emotional harm and minimizing any potential risks. So if people are traveling to meetings, or they're traveling to conferences to talk about your research, or you're talking about things in your research that might cause emotional harm, you really need to think about how you can protect people and minimize any risks. Informed decision making, again, is important. People with dementia have the right to make decisions about being involved in your research. And as researchers, we need to ensure that decision making is supported and informed. And there are guidelines and resources available to help you with doing that. Confidentiality and anonymity, again, is important. This is keeping personal and sensitive information confidential. So that might be information that people share as part of your research group, or it might be research information that can be shared. And you might want to think about confidentiality agreements and how that information can be kept anonymous. And then again, we talk about language a lot. So using very simple language with respectful language, trying not to use jargon, avoiding acronyms and abbreviations. And I would really recommend the Dementia Australia language guidelines. If you haven't already downloaded them, it's a really good place to start. So some things to think about in terms of planning. It's really good to get support at a senior level. So that could be your research director or your supervisor. And you need to allocate time. So proper involvement takes time, and you need to add this into your research timelines. Funding, it's really helpful to have allocated funding for involvement. So this includes reimbursements for people's time and out-of-pocket expenses. And if you can, try and include these costs in your grant applications. And if you can get it, it's really helpful to have admin support. So somebody who can help with booking meetings, sending invitations, sending minutes, posting things out, if email is not the best way of communication for some people. Really helpful. Support and training, we talked about a little bit. So just like researchers, people come from different backgrounds. We all have different knowledge and skills and experiences to share. Not everybody has prior experience of research, and people may need additional support and training. And that includes researchers. Researchers may need additional training as well. You can ask your research institution if they provide this training, if you have a consumer involvement group or panel. There are consumer groups that provide this training as well, and I've provided some links at the end of these slides. And this training, some of it's free, some of it you have to pay for, some of it is face-to-face, some of it is online. But it's really useful to think about how you can support people to be involved in your research, and training yourself as well. And then think about monitoring and evaluating and reporting the involvement. So this can really help improve processes. So just asking people what's working well for you, what hasn't worked well for you, everybody involved, how can we improve things? Think about evaluating and reporting on impact and outcomes in your publications and your outputs. And there are guidelines to help you do this. One of these is the GRIP, and that can be used to help improve the quality and transparency of your work. So there's just a few useful links. NHMRC, Involve UK has got some really good research resources. The Clinical Trials Alliance has a really good involvement toolkit. Consumers Health Forum. DA have got some really good resources for supporting people with dementia to take part in meetings and Zoom meetings. And then some training links. There are some free training for researchers, there's some paid training. There's also a resource developed by the NNIDR, which is a guide for people living with dementia and their care partners and family members that you can download to give to people who may wish to become involved in your research. And I'd just like to acknowledge all the members of the DCRC Lived Experience Group, and that is my contact Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. That was so helpful. And the guidelines that you're working on sound like they'll be a really valuable resource as well. So looking forward to seeing those next year. We have a great question from Eamon. He says, do you have any examples of how the lived experience group has enriched your research?
I think just from bringing people together and having the conversations about researchers and people with lived experience and how we can work together. In my own research, I have different research projects in different research institutions, and we have involvement with people with lived experience in those. And it's just great to have those discussions like really early on. Is this a good idea? Am I on the right track with this proposal? What feedback can you give me about the ideas? Is this an important area to research? How can we best involve people through this research? Have those conversations, and it's really good if you can have the conversations as early on as possible. It's never too late to start, I have to say as well. You know, it's better to do something than nothing, but having those conversations on early is really, really helpful. I just have to say that the DCRC is coming to an end in the end of December. I don't know if everybody is aware of that. So we are now looking at ways of taking the group forward, possibly working with Dementia Australia next year. So it's one of those things with funding. I know it happened with the NNIDR group as well. It's a common thing. Funding comes to an end, and we have all this experience and momentum, and we want to keep things going.
Yeah, that sounds great. If you can work with Dementia Australia, so I've worked with them in the past, and they've been really fantastic to work with. So thank you. I'll introduce our next person who will introduce the next speaker, Dr. Julian Ben Salem. Over to you.
Thanks, Claire. And thanks, everyone. So now we're going to hear about Dr. Akunle Bademosi. So first, thanks, Adekunle, for agreeing to give this talk today. Dr. Adekunle is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Queensland Brain Institute at the University of Queensland. He had his master and doctorate degree training in neuroscience research at the same institute. After that, he moved to Belgium in 2018 for his first postdoctoral research, where he applied advanced single molecule imaging to study Parkinson's disease. And he moved back to Australia last year, where he obtained a fellowship to study how proteins clump abnormally in frontotemporal dementia and motor neuron disease. And so today he's going to talk about how he involves people living with dementia in his research. So yeah, when you're ready, Adekunle.
Oh, good. Thanks so much for the introduction, and indeed thanks to the organizers for indeed inviting me to give this talk today. Just want to acknowledge that it's been great hearing everybody, Anne and Jane, as well as Deborah. It was just pretty exciting. So as I said earlier, I did obtain a fellowship. So my current research as a fundamental researcher is funded by the Dementia Australia Research Foundation, which has been pretty exciting for me. So in just going through today, before talking about my current experience working with people living with dementia, as well as the carers and family, I just thought to share a bit, first of all, of my own personal motivation for my scientific research, just a very little bit as well on what I do before moving on to my current experience. So here's a family picture of myself with my grandma, where I grew up with, and I really, really loved before she passed away a few years ago. Of course, I think my story may not be that strange. Many people have experienced this, where a family member suddenly develops dementia. And for me, this was pretty unique as well, because I remember as a younger child that my grandma had a photographic memory. And yeah, suddenly when I was in my second year of undergraduate studies, she suddenly, the symptoms for dementia started. And it was a pretty difficult time for the whole family to be able to deal with my grandma suddenly losing her memory, you know. And this is where my passion for research started. So today, as a researcher, I don't just do research to develop my career. I have a motivation because of what happened with my grandma, the pain we went through, the difficulty we went through in taking good care of her and ensuring she had a lovely time in the last 4 years post her diagnosis, after which she died. And so based on this experience, this is what motivates me as a researcher today. And what's my research about? What we know is that indeed dementia affects the brain, and the brain is made up of billions of these small units called neurons. And these neurons are in continuous communication with each other. So as I'm talking now, what's happening in my brain is that is a bit of what we see here, where a form of signals are passed across from one part of the brain to the other. And one thing I just want to call your attention to is that you have these very tiny proteins which sort of mediate and ensure that different parts of these neurons can talk with each other. This is pretty exciting. We've definitely established this. We know this and we've characterized this. However, this is where the enigma starts. We know that in people living with dementia, like my grandma, that something stops what I just showed from working properly. And just like the tiny proteins I called attention to earlier, those proteins are not the only one that do the function. There are many other proteins in the body that are involved in ensuring you have a normal communication. And at times at the onset of dementia, you have some of these proteins clumping together abnormally, as Julian mentioned earlier in my introduction. And that's what I study. As these proteins clump, what ultimately happens is that the clumping of these proteins, which is not normal, because it's what we call an abnormal clumping. Essentially, this happens within each of the small, tiny neurons in the brain. And this ultimately leads to the death of these neurons. And this becomes so bad because at times when one neuron dies, you don't feel a symptom immediately. At times it takes thousands of neurons trying to feel a symptom. And one death of just one of these neurons could release bad proteins that would affect other surrounding neurons as well. And so that's where my research is in the lab at the moment. I'm looking at two major diseases. I'm looking at both frontotemporal dementia, which affects this part of the brain labeled here, as well as motor neuron disease. You know, these are very debilitating diseases, and I can't even imagine what it feels like. The little I can, it's my own experience with my grandma. But what we do know about this two is that they actually have a bit of a shared or common phenomenon, and it's that normally the proteins which I mentioned earlier normally sit, you know, nicely in a specific part of the neuron. However, at the onset of either motor neuron disease or frontotemporal disease, you have a mislocalization or a transportation from this central hub into the different parts of the neuron, which ultimately leads to the toxicity or to these neurons dying. And so the question I ask as a fundamental researcher is, what can I do to sort of study these proteins as they start to, you know, clump together and ultimately lead to this damage? This is pretty difficult to do, but the cool thing I have at my facility is this equipment called the super resolution microscope. In brief, what it does is it allows me to look at these proteins in very, very clear details. Now, you may be wondering, why am I showing, you know, a bit of my research? It's just for you to get a bit of a context of where my passion is as a researcher, especially from my own experience with my grandma. And this is what the microscope is able to do, just like a telescope, you know, or a satellite up in the sky, able to zoom down and narrow in on a coin in your backyard. It allows me to be able to narrow in and see in details these proteins before they clump, as well as they start clumping. And so this is an example of what it does. Each of the single bright spots you see here are just one tiny protein of this type of proteins that sort of clump together. So I can sort of start to study them before they clump, as they clump, and after they've clumped as well. And so I'm able to get this sort of map out that sort of gives me an overall idea as to what is happening to the proteins when they're within clumps and when they're outside clumps. Okay. So what are the potential of some of the things I do? One of the key things that I see as a potential of my research is that it creates a potential diagnostic tool. So if we can see these proteins before the clump, then it becomes a great way for us to sort of diagnose if someone is at risk of developing the disease. Now, the interesting thing is that the protein clumping I've mentioned, this phenomenon is not just peculiar to frontotemporal dementia, motor neuron disease. It's prevalent in Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, which I've previously studied, in Lewy bodies with dementia, in many types of dementia. So this creates a potential diagnostic tool, and that's what I'm trying to develop, is to say, okay, we need to develop some of these diagnostic tools way earlier than the symptoms actually start, which is a big thing that as a fundamental neuroscientist we really, really want to do. The second part is that we know that many pharmaceutical companies are out there developing drugs day in, day out. And the big thing in the field is that they develop these drugs, it gets to the final phase of clinical trials, and suddenly they're like, oh, sorry, this is not working. But can you imagine if we can actually check these drugs before they're actually tested in the clinic for clinical trials, where we can see if they're actually preventing the protein clumps, if they're breaking down these clumps and actually have an effect. So this is a bit of what I do. And then I'll bring it back home to, so how do I involve people living with dementia, their carers, in my research? I see myself as a person who's cared for someone living with dementia. So this all starts in many ways with me. And the very first thing I do, I only have like 3 major experiences so far. The first thing I do is that I have this sort of, in collaboration with my institute, I take full advantage of what we have in form of lab visits. Now, this is different from just people who come in to have a tour of the institute. Here's a person, Kali, a good friend, who came in earlier in March and was just interested in knowing what happens in the research lab. So she came in, was fully kitted, and then came to the lab with me to have a few hours or a few minutes of just seeing me do my experiments. And I really enjoyed this time of her being in the lab, because she asked questions I had not thought of. As a scientist, the times where it's so focused on our research and everybody's really looking at to maybe publish a paper and the nitty-gritty of the pressure of academia. But she was asking me, oh, why are you looking at this protein? Why are you looking at this mutation in this protein? How does this translate to a clinic? And that's essentially helps me in planning for my next 6 months of experiments. So some of the experiments I'm doing today is of these discussions I have when people come into a lab visit, and I always love having the questions that are asked. The second part is what I'm currently working in the institute. We actually set up this meeting where it was geared towards having a discussion and a monthly sort of meeting with caregivers of people living with dementia. And our idea was to be able to have daily interactions or monthly interactions to give them a sort of report as to, okay, this is what we've done for the past month, and this is where we are going, and get feedback from them. As much as we have the idea for this, we've not been able to kick this off properly because of, as we're aware of, the COVID pandemic. But in early 2022, this is something I'm looking forward to, kick off in my lab here, where we'll be able to indeed have this sort of interactions and a bit expanded on the type of lab visits that I have experience in. And finally, one of the things I try to do in my research is to actually, go to the hospitals or clinicians and say, could you give me the opportunity to actually reach out to people living with dementia and actually have direct discussions with them? And as a scientist, this has been one of the biggest roadblocks I've had, where we're told, oh, you don't have the ethical permission to be in the hospital to have a direct discussion with people living with dementia. And so the way around it, or what I do at the moment as a scientist, is that we have this sort of meetings where clinicians and scientists come together. They present case studies of people that they're treating, of their patients. And this becomes an opportunity for us to have an indirect contact with people living with dementia, where we're able to ask questions, ask them, so what exactly do you think as a clinician for our research? Where do you think we can take this in 5 years' time, in 4 years' time, and in 10 years' time? And so in brief, this is what my research is about. And this is a way in which over the past 4 to 5 years, I've been opportuned to actually reach out in this field to people living with dementia, both on the personal experience as well as in my research field. I think I'll just stop here and give time for questions. Thanks, Julian.
Thank you very much, Kunle. That was very interesting. It's interesting too that you actually are one person with lead experience. Mm-hmm. So if you have any question, you can put them here either in the chat or Q&A, Q&A preferably. how did you do to start to do all of that? So you went in Belgium, and then you came back last year. So did you start to talk with people before coming to Australia, or after that?
Maybe I'll just share a short brief of my journey. So I knew from the get-go that I needed a bit more experience to be able to get into the field of studying dementia at its fundamental level. So for my PhD, when I started my research, I didn't go directly into dementia. I wanted to get trained in a tool, a novel tool that nobody else had used in the field of dementia to start to answer those questions. So that's where I learned my super resolution imaging technique, where I applied it in the field of general anesthetics, so just still in the clinical context, however, not in the context of what I had my own personal experiences with my grandma. And so having been trained there, then I decided to go over to Belgium, where I had a great experience working with someone who was well established in the field of Parkinson's disease. And then we started to ask questions on, okay, is it even possible to apply this technology in the field of Parkinson's disease? And indeed, we saw it was possible. So having finished there, the next move for me was then to move further in, into what I was more interested in, which was a bit of what my own grandma had, which was a form of frontotemporal dementia. So I moved on into that in coming back here, and I'm pretty enjoying my current research at the moment. So yes.
That's great.
Yep.
You were talking also about lab visits. So we do, as you said, where I work, we do visits of the institute. So they're called tours. We also have students coming sometimes just to visit the lab. So they're not like at uni yet. They're just coming for a tour. Do you do tours with just like people without any living experience of dementia, or also with people with like carers, or can you have actually sometimes some patients coming from memory clinics?
Yes. So definitely, we actually do both. And maybe I'll just say there's a bit, I think there's a bit of a difference between having the tour groups who come into the institute and people who just really want to see us do that research and just sit down there and actually watch us, and which is my own experience. I've had both, where I've just shown a bit of, oh, this is an excellent tool we have to do research in the lab, and there are questions there, but I found it more engaging. In this case, for the picture I showed, it's Kylie, where she spent time to actually, see me from a bit of the start to the end of a full experiment and ask questions. And I definitely enjoy those side, because it actually gets me thinking, much more deeply as to how my research can, go into a bit of more translation at a much faster pace. Yeah.
All right.
Sure.
Okay. I think just looking at the time, we have allocated 10 minutes for more question and answer. So additionally, of course, you can have more questions there, but also questions for everyone else, or if you want to have a discussion all together. But thank you for your presentation, and thanks for doing your work. And yeah, that was great. And thanks everyone to Nadika, if you want to facilitate the next session.
Great, thank you very much, Julian. What fascinating talks. I'm really impressed by both talks from Debra and Adkin, as well as our discussion by Anne and Jane today. So I'm just going to get all panel members to turn on your videos, if that's okay, and your microphones. And we've got about 7 minutes before we end our discussion session. So I'm just going to look at what other Q&A questions are there. And a few audience, I'm just asking everybody, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A panel. This is your time. So to begin with in this session, there is a fundamental question that Teresa Scott is asking here. First of all, she's saying thanks to both Jane and Anne for your input, of course. And it's about networking. There's so many groups of people who sort of little pots of groups with people involving dementia that researchers are sort of setting up. And sometimes it could overburden people with living experiences. And I've heard this from my advocates as well, that sometimes it's really hard for them to say no, because they're just probably so interested in being part of research. And I can see Anne and Jane nodding their heads. So, because I can see you both are heavily involved. I guess, I mean, how do we safeguard this? How do we sort of, is there a way to solve this situation? So in terms of some advice for any people with lived experiences or their supporters are here, and for researchers as well. And I guess the other part to this is, how do we get more people with lived experiences, their care partners and their families be involved in research? So maybe it's sort of like a two-part question. So in that way, we don't have to overburden, we don't have to keep asking the same person who participated in research. So who would like to sort of take on this question? Thank you, Jane.
Yeah. Look, I think we're not very good at saying no. I think that's true. And but I am actually starting to learn to say, okay, this sounds really interesting, but am I actually the right person for this? Because there are a whole lot of us who have been around for quite a long time who tend to get approached all the time. And sometimes, and I have said no sometimes, because I've actually looked at the project and I thought, I actually don't have the right experience to contribute to that project. So I think that's one thing. I think we do need to learn to say no, but also to say to researchers, okay, now what is the sort of person who would be most appropriate for this particular project? And don't just go to the same old people all the time. But I think actually if you have an advisory group, say, associated with a project, and that's one of the benefits, I think, of the Cobalt study that Anne and I are involved in that I mentioned. So we've got quite a large group just for our Australian advisory group. We've got about 8 people on it at the moment. In the UK group, they have about 20, I think, people involved. So if documents get sent out for review, then some of the people will do it, but not everybody has to be involved in everything all the time. So you can actually share the load, I think. But of course, that means you need a good pool of people that you can draw on. So, which then leads into the question of, how do we find more people to be involved and create those pathways for involvement? And again, I think, we've got lots of these little subgroups forming. I think if somehow they could all connect together and grow, a large group, like the Alzheimer's Society in the UK has a huge group of volunteers, they're called, who belong to their research network. I think they've got a couple of hundred people who can be drawn on by researchers at different times. So building up that pool, I think it's going to require some leadership, somebody who steps in and says, this is a great thing we need to we need to actually put some funding into making sure that it happens. And maybe Dementia Australia is going in that sort of direction. We need to perhaps promote that idea, because they're the obvious way of finding people with dementia and carers, because they have their huge network of their advocates, but also other people who seek services, etc., through Dementia Australia. So
absolutely,
yeah, I agree with that. I was just going to say that I think Dementia Australia is getting more involved in co-design and in things, and I think they'll be bringing people up sort of that we can buddy with, and so that you're not going to get people who don't know anything about the research. I mean, a researcher really wants somebody who's had some experience and that they know what they're talking about, I guess, from as a person living with dementia, had been involved. And I think Dementia Australia's got a really good handle on that and should be doing more. And I think with Kate Harding, she's very involved in trying to build the research advocacy roles. So hopefully get some more. But it is a bit again, one of those ad hoc things too.
And it probably has to be a partnership between Dementia Australia
Yeah.
and research organisations who all get together and support
Absolutely.
this to happen.
Absolutely. I think
Yeah.
it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
Researchers need to advocate as well. And you're absolutely right. There should be some leadership and movement to generate income at the same time to support this network. And if we do have a network, that would be wonderful. That just will help a lot of researchers within this space. So unfortunately, we have sort of run out of time now. But to recap our webinar, it has been an amazing morning. And I was blown away to hear the discussions we've had and the amazing involvement that both Jane and Anne have been involved within dementia research in this space. And I really thank you for sharing your thoughts in this space for our ADNeT involving people with living experiences webinar. And at the same time, we've just had really good talks from the researcher and from Debra and ADNeT. So really fascinating and informative for both researchers as well as people who are involved in research from the other end. So so thank you, and thank you for the audience with your amazing questions and being engaged with our webinar. So now I would like to close our webinar, and thanks again for everybody, and thanks for your involvement. So a recording of our webinar will be advertised, will be placed in the ADNeT researcher under the researcher tab. You can find our Accelerator group events and all webinar recordings there. So go and visit us at ADNeT website. So thank you very much, and I will conclude the webinar today. Have a great day.
Thank you, Nadika. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.